Deep Dive. My name is Guy Baker and I'm the editor of the Marine Biologist magazine. What is the Deep Dive? Well, for those of you who haven't joined one before, it's a fairly new initiative of the Marine Biological Association. It's a live online conversation that builds on the content of our quarterly magazine, The Marine Biologist. So each quarter we choose an article from the magazine and we invite the author and experts in the field to join us and to dive deeper into the subject. So we'll really try and get our teeth into it, a bit like a pajama shark chewing an octopus. And as this is the third deep dive, this morning we'll be talking about the importance for science and society of natural history. And this is inspired by an article in the recent edition of the Marine Biologist here that came out in October. And the article is entitled Fighting for the Life of Natural History, and it's written by Ferdinando Boero. I shared the link in the chat, so if you haven't had a chance to look at it yet, you might want to have a browse while we're talking. One or two things to mention before we begin, before I introduce our guests, is some virtual housekeeping for the event. It's going to go on for about 45 minutes to an hour. We will be recording, and so for that reason, all your microphones and cameras have been muted. Please do not enable them during the meeting because we will be recording, so we'll try and keep it nice and clean and undisrupted. If you do inadvertently enable your microphone or camera, they will be disabled by a member of the MBA staff. And so for the deep dive, you can take part, you can join in. There's a chat function in Zoom. And if you put your questions and comments in the chat box in Zoom, we will endeavour to put them all to our guests this morning. And so to our guests, we're delighted to welcome Ferdinando Boero and T.Oates. So welcome to you both. It's a real pleasure to have you both here. And also welcome to everyone who's joined us, MBA members, vital to the life of the Marine Biological Association. And it's a great privilege really to be able to meet everyone like this and use this opportunity to build our community. So I'll give a little bit of information about Nando and Tim, and then I'll start some questions and we can start the conversation. So Ferdinando Boero is Professor of Zoology at the Department of Biology at the University of Naples, Federico II. He works on biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, evolution and ecology. He's the author of no less than 234 scientific articles, the editor of 6 scientific books and the author of 9 scientific books. And he's won numerous awards for his academic and scientific achievements and communications work indeed. And his work has been mentioned by the New York Times. He's had a story that made the cover of the Time magazine, and the musician Frank Zappa has written a song in his honor, and I'm sure you'll be as intrigued as I am to hear a little bit more about that later in the conversation. So welcome, Mando. It's a great pleasure. T.Oates, CBE, is Group Director of Assessment, Research and Development at Cambridge Assessment. Cambridge Assessment operates and manages 3 exam boards and undertakes research on assessment in education. He's widely published in the education and training research field, and he runs a large research group that focuses on national and international research on assessment and measurement. So I hope that's an up-to-date, very brief bio for you, Tim. And T.Oates, welcome. Great pleasure to have you joining us this morning. Okay, so without any further ado, I would first of all like to ask our guests, given that the subject is natural history, and that means people being in nature, really. What first inspired you, Mando, to be a marine biologist?
Well, it's biology, I presume, because biophilia and natural love for living things is the trademark of our species when we are young. So all children are fond of nature, and I was no exception. Then you go to school and they try to eradicate it from you. They weren't successful with me. And so I continued to have the same attitude. And so it was natural for me to become a naturalist, as all children want to be.
Thank you, Mando. Tim, I should have mentioned in your introduction that you've been one of the main forces in this drive to introduce a new GCSE in natural history into the national curriculum in England. And because of that, you must be passionate about nature. Can you tell us about your own introduction to the natural world?
Yeah, and I've been working intensively on this provision of a proposed GCSE in natural history with a number of people, but including politicians and specialists, and I'll come on to exactly who those are in a moment. But in terms of myself, yeah, look, I'm a white male. I came from a very bourgeois family. My family was an artist. And so that falls into a stereotype that people are talking about in terms of people interested in the natural world, something I want to go on to dispel. But I will talk about my own experience. I was a bit of a feral child, living in Wiltshire in an extraordinary place in Downland. And I spent my childhood up to my knees in chalk streams, chasing crayfish. And wandering in amazing stands of beaches. You know, it was an extraordinary childhood, and I valued it hugely, and it connected me with nature in a very, very intimate way. In my adulthood, I spent a lot of time up mountains, and I've seen the changes there. And again, I feel very passionately about the natural environment and about the changes which are occurring. But I've worked with Mary Colwell, who's really championed and was the originator of the concept of a GCSE in natural history. Worked very closely with Caroline Lucas, Green Party, who's championed this, and with politicians and other specialists. And we're very, very enthusiastic about what's happening.
Fantastic, thank you. Just unmuting myself there. Mando, if I could ask you to sort of launch into the subject of education, what is your opinion of how marine biology is taught in schools and universities? And do you think it should change to increase the focus on marine natural history?
Well, not all universities are the same. And so in different states, there are different things. I assisted to a lecture of the dean of a very important Canadian university that we left unnamed, that said that they were very keen in teaching marine biology and ecosystems. I asked her if they had courses on biodiversity and taxonomy, and they don't. So they teach things more based on mathematical models, simulations, but not actually to go out there and look at things and recognize species, if not with molecular tools. So there is a shift. You know that the next decade will be the decade of the sea, of the ocean. Do you know what was the decade that is going to end? The United Nations decade. It was biodiversity. And people didn't realize that. So biodiversity is fading away from curricula. There are less and less people who know species, which is very strange. This is happening not only in Italy, this is happening everywhere. So there is a mismatch between what is considered as very important, biodiversity. We all agree that it's very important. They all agree that it's very important. But then the knowledge on biodiversity is fading away, which is very strange. There is a logical conflict between the two things. What is said to be very important and what is practiced in reality.
I want to absolutely reinforce that. We're suffering from a number of contradictions in precisely the way that Mando outlines. And I think by good lobbying and effective action in policy, we can resolve those contradictions. Just as young people are saying that there's been a failure of major institutions and processes to act to protect the environment, so too those young people are increasingly distanced from the natural world. Now, the provision of opportunities like a natural history GCSE for 13 to 16-year-olds, we believe is part of a complex response, part of a jigsaw. It's one piece of a complex jigsaw of measures that we need to put in place. It's certainly the case, as Nando has very, very clearly outlined, that research studies in higher education have moved away from the study of whole organisms in context to more abstracted understandings of the nature and behavior of organisms. And just some very quick statistics. A survey in England, 83% of children aged between 5 and 16 could not identify a bumblebee. 97% could not identify a beech leaf. 96% could not identify a cabbage white butterfly. And 1 in 5 children living in England's most deprived areas spend no time in the natural environment. Now, during the 1920s and 30s, we had clubs and associations and societies which weren't class-based, which ran right the way across society, working class as well as privileged, that were involved in nature study and engagement and visits, whole organisms in context, going out into nature. That is all gone. And we did it before. It was remarkable in terms of what it produced, in terms of amateur scientific understanding. We need to achieve the same again, in my view.
Can I add something to this? Oh, I'm not hearing anymore.
No, for sure, Nando.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Okay. Okay. You know, the UK is maybe #1 in the world for naturalistic documentaries with the BBC, Attenborough, and so on. So you are exposed to TV programs that are of very high quality. Now also in Italy, we are trying to do something similar, not achieving the same results, but anyway, and I have participated to many of these. But this is natural history taken as entertainment, not as culture. So they want the public to say, oh, but rarely they lead people to say, and to understand what is going on. It's just entertainment. If I ask you what is the most important animal of the planet, very few people, in spite of thousands and thousands of hours of programs dedicated to nature, will tell copepods. They don't even know what they are. Copepods are the link between the primary producers and phytoplankton and the rest of the food chain in the whole ocean. Copepods and animals like them, rotifers or whatever. I said that during a TV program in Italy, and before the recording, no, it was live. But anyway, the conductor told me, oh, say that about the copepods. And I said, yes, but I say something, but if there is not sufficient knowledge, but I just give an information, but behind there is no knowledge. They said, okay, but anyway, we'll show one in the back. And they went looking at that. I didn't check what they were showing behind, and it was a rotifer. So it's a different phylum. The tragedy is that those who were supposed to illustrate nature to the people through television, which is a very powerful medium, didn't know that. And the majority of the people who saw that didn't realize that they were showing a horse instead of a cricket. But so but that program goes on every day for 3 hours. But it's just entertainment. So nature is present very often on TV, but it's not presented as a form of culture. It's a form of entertainment. So it has to shift from O to A, and people should understand something. They don't understand, they are entertained. So this is a big problem, because we are there all the time. But for what? To entertain people. If they speak about culture, it's a completely different story. Other people arrive, but not naturalists. So this is, and the person who changed the most our culture and our vision of ourselves is a naturalist, is Charles Darwin. It changed our vision of ourselves in nature. It's philosophy, but it's not taken as philosophy. The philosophers arrive, if it's philosophy, and speak about other things.
Thank
So
you,
Guy, you mentioned that. Sorry, go on, Guy.
No, I was just saying thank you to Nando, and thinking as he was talking that there's a complex mosaic of things like entertainment and natural history documentaries and education, and also how parents introduce nature to their children. But that's something we might want to touch on later. Tim, I'd like to let you go ahead and respond to Mando.
Yeah, I mean, I think this notion that of culture, and where culture consists of a complex interplay of new understandings, new knowledge, and action, engagement with nature, and changing the way in which people see things, but also what they do. I think that's absolutely what we're trying to focus on, and that's absolutely what Mary was engaged in, with the provision of a qualification for 16-year-olds being part of the picture. Guy, you mentioned the national curriculum. And when we revised the national curriculum in 2010, implemented in 2014 in England, we revised the way in which engagement with nature was expressed in the curriculum for primary school kids. It had two elements within it which are fundamental and pick up absolutely what Nando was emphasizing. One, actually getting out there, collecting, observing, engaging with in the field, and then understanding through classification, description. And so to rebuild culture, the national curriculum was designed to play a role in that, and it is doing so now. But Mary also emphasized the importance of something which would encourage and motivate older children and be a target, and to structure the learning. And that's why the provision of the GCSE was seen as so important. You know, in England, qualifications are important. They are targets to which people look in structuring the curriculum, and they provide detailed content. Now, we've laid out the aims and content of the GCSE in national curriculum, in natural history, and we have consulted on that. It was an incredibly successful consultation that we ran over the last few months, over 2,500 respondents, and the support was overwhelming. And very often we run these consultations and it's a bit ambiguous, a bit ambivalent. No, in this instance, it was overwhelming. 90% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed with the definition of natural history, and nearly 100% agreed or strongly agreed that outdoor study should be an important part of the GCSE. Now, we presented that report to government and they're considering it. They've been rightly quite reluctant to accept new subjects into the list of qualifications which we run in our country. But we hope with a fair wind and really the kind of center of gravity that the respondents to the consultation represent, that we will get a favorable response. but we think it's desperately needed. Young people are supporting it, and we can encourage the development of this culture that Nando has so strongly emphasized.
Thank you, Tim. Yes, I wanted to ask actually specifically about the GCSE. For young, I mean, I realise a lot of young people will be at school today, but we hopefully will get some tuning in later. But for young people who are following this conversation, what would the new GCSE give them that the existing subjects like biology and geography and so on won't? How will it work amongst those?
Well, we've paid a great deal of attention to that because it is clear that you don't add subjects to the list of qualifications unless they contribute something unique. So for sure, there's some overlap with history, biology, chemistry, geography, but there's kind of there's no more overlap than there is overlap between maths and physics. You know, there's maths in physics, but what we've done very carefully is to construct a series of aims, a body of content, and a set of learning activities which will contribute uniquely to the curriculum in England. So there's key content in terms of field study, the study of whole organisms in context, with field studies being a very important component of the qualification. There's also an emphasis on the representation of the natural world in literature and art, and a study of how man has engaged with nature and how we've represented nature over time. All of these things link to geography and biology, and in some cases draw down concepts and terminology from them, but it represents a unique contribution to the curriculum in total.
Thank you, Tim.
Very interesting.
Sorry, Mando, go ahead.
Yes, very interesting. And I'm trying to propose a similar thing in Italy. So I will try to interact with Tim in the future to profit from the UK experience. In our experience, children get out of school, they go back home, they don't know the names of the trees they meet on the road. And the tragedy is that not even the teachers know these names, not to speak about the animals. And they don't know what trees are original of this country and what trees come from other countries. And there is history behind, because they were brought in the past to our country. So there is a lack of perception of the nature around us, which has to be revived by just looking. I made an experiment in citizen science on jellyfish. Jellyfish are not very popular organisms because they sting people who go swimming. But the children became very engaged in this, and I received the emails from the parents that were worried because their sons and daughters were giving Latin names to the jellyfish they were seeing. Saying, "Mom, don't touch that. It's a chrysaura. It will sting you. You can touch that one because it's not a jellyfish, it's a salp." And they say, how do they know these things? They had a poster, we published the poster, and children learned the names and the shapes of these animals without studying. They didn't study the things. They were attracted by nature, naturally. When they go to school, this is erased and they have to suffer to gain knowledge. Children are built to learn from nature. And we are eradicating this attitude and replacing it with something else, which has to come later, which has to come later. We started our culture by looking at nature. The paintings in the caves are zoology, because there are animals. So our culture started with zoology. And this is the phylogeny of our culture. The ontogeny of our culture in every individual starts exactly with the same curiosities for animals and plants. We have to encourage that. Instead, it is discouraged. It disappears from the curricula. And we have to fight to put it in. If children were studying these things at the very beginning of their studies, then they would become interested also in mathematics and poetry. Instead, we remove nature and we start with mathematics and poetry, which is very bad for their mental health. It has to come later. It is important, but it has to come later. So we remove the basis of our culture, which is nature, and replace it with something that came later. So we need to restudy the history of our culture. It started with zoology, I'm sorry, because we were hunters and gatherers. The males were zoologists, the females were botanists, and the children, because they were gathering things. And they had to know the animals and the plants. Our culture started with that. We removed that from the ontogeny of our culture. It's a big mistake, because we are still interested in that when we start our life.
Thank you, Nando. That's a fascinating insight and perspective. What I think I'd like to do, unless you've got anything you'd like to come in with, what I thought I might do is go over to the chat and ask one or two questions from the chat. Is that okay? Okay. So we have a question from, scrolling up now. From a question from Youssef, who says, and Tim, you covered some of this. How would a GCSE in natural history, emphasizing practical field biology and species identification, complement current science GCSEs and contemporary research directions in the higher education academic field? So perhaps it's the second part of that question, Tim, that you might want to address.
Yeah, for sure. So when Mary and I were laying down the initial aims for the GCSE and actually looking at the content specification, we undertook a lot of discussions right the way across education, from early years through to higher education. One of the themes that emerged in the discussions with universities and with research scientists was the extent to which they also had detected the kind of neglect of whole organisms and the engagement with the natural world in respect to the study of whole organisms, which Nando outlined. And they said, well, for a lot of our biology undergraduate courses, what we find is that the zoological elements are declining and the botanical elements are declining in terms of the study of whole organisms and species in context. There's been a lot more abstraction in the study of biochemistry, the study of populations and so on, which has led to an abstraction within undergraduate study and a removal of literal day-to-day engagement in the natural world. And so it's not universal, but it's a tendency. And they said, we really would like to see this put right in terms of the school curriculum, to make sure that young people have an opportunity to engage with the natural world, but at the same time to accumulate a deeper knowledge at the level of scientific understanding. We then scrutinized the specifications in the national curriculum and in the qualifications for the existing sciences, biology, chemistry, physics. And although, in Cambridge, they're grouped together as the natural sciences, They have, in recent years, in order to deal with the massive explosion of human knowledge and scientific knowledge, they have tended to focus on principles. They have tended to focus on the abstract expression of mechanisms. And it's understandable, but nobody spotted that that was increasing the distance from the natural world. And so I referred earlier to the extent to which this was designed as complementary to, not as competing with or undermining the existing sciences. It really is complementary, adding something which has been squeezed out and which people didn't notice was being squeezed out, but now they've noticed it, they feel that it's a real loss and would like to see it reinstated. So I hope that really describes the way in which we've tried to position the GCSE in relationship to the other sciences.
Thank you, Tim. I have a question from Matt Frost. He asks, research agencies provide lots of funding for satellites, modelling, and new technologies such as eDNA, but relatively little for classic naturalist studies and taxonomy. This is influencing career pathways. How can we address this? And I'll put it to either of you who'd like to go ahead.
Well, Mando, do you want to go first?
Yes, thanks. The problem is not the funding agencies or the politicians. Descriptor number 1 of good environmental status in the Marine Strategy Framework Directive is biodiversity is maintained. And so how do you check this if you don't know the species? Biodiversity is number 1 in many priorities in all treaties and so on. The problem is not the recognition of these by politicians. The problem is the recognition of these in the scientific community. The people who study these things, for instance, do not publish in high impacting journals. And if your impact factor is low, you are a low quality scientist. And so the way the research is evaluated is undermining the possibility of promoting taxonomy. By the way, the impact factor is one of the measures of the quality of journals. The other one is another one, which is, in my opinion, very important, is the half-life of the journals. For how long an article keeps being cited after its publication. More than 10 is infinity. The journals with the highest impact factors have very low the permanence of citation, the half-life of the papers. And the lowest the impact factor, the highest the half-life. But we are praising only the impact factor. Now researchers are evaluated. They have to run for positions. If they have a curriculum on taxonomy, their value is very low under these terms. So it's obvious that these guys keep disappearing from the scientific community. And the steering committees and so on are made of scientists who are not taxonomists. In the rooms where the decisions are taken, there are no taxonomists anymore. And so it's a problem in the scientific community. And this is why there is this mismatch between what is stated to be very important, biodiversity, species, and so on, and what is actually done. The United Nations sent an alarm about the disappearance of 1 million species in the next few years. I would like to say, tell me one that became extinct. We don't know. These are estimates. People do these things with computers. They don't go out there to look. So there is a mismatch between the statements and the actions. The actions do not correspond to the statements. And the problem is in the scientific community. How many taxonomists do you have in Cambridge?
Well,
how many? Come on. There was a course in hydrozoan taxonomy in Ireland at the marine station in Portaferry. It was on hydrozoans and bryozoans. They invited me to give the course in the UK on hydrozoan taxonomy. You know why they invited me? Because none were left in the UK. And the person who gave the course on bryozoans is John Ryland. He was in his 80s, okay? In his 80s. So there is a problem, because if there are no more taxonomists in the faculties, who will make proposals to hire new taxonomists? The biochemists want more biochemists. The molecular biologists want more molecular biologists.
And that was exactly the gap which we discussed with the academics here. You're absolutely right, Mando. And they were aware of it and were anxious that it was corrected. I think I'd add to your important discussion of the drivers and incentives which operate within academia in terms of which areas are funded and which areas are neglected and which areas grow. I'd like to add to that by saying that actually one group that is most sensitive to the composition of public sentiment is politicians. That group is incredibly sensitive to what people think. Now, if we have these contradictions in young people, that they're concerned about the environment but feel very distant from it, if they have a general anxiety but are unable to express it in specific forms, then I think we've got a problem, because the politicians will be paying attention to public culture, but public culture will have voids within it. And that's why the education becomes so important. What we've put, Mando, by the way, in the specification of the 5 key areas, the last 2 are these, and I'll read them out very briefly: description, classification, and interpretation of the natural world in human culture and the way in which this has changed over time. And critically, micro, meso, and macro ways of seeing organisms, from the tiny to the large and from the local to the international. And it is really trying to transform the way in which young people see the world, so that they no longer walk past a lichen growing on a wall. They no longer walk past the weed growing in the pavement. And they look at the very small, as well as the large and furry and attractive. You know, this is fundamental. It's really to go back to a tradition that we did have established. We had amateurs with magnifying glasses looking at common tiny organisms all around, understanding how they worked, how to classify them, how to distinguish them, how to see what their behavior was, to see what the tendencies were around them. This was fantastic and extraordinary at the end of the 19th century. It contributed to the current scientific establishment. But the scientific establishment, as you say, Nando, has gone off on paths which are understandable, but have left that tradition behind. We desperately need to re-establish it.
Yes, and it's a problem also with the philosophy of science. You said a word that defines as a bad science, descriptive science. Descriptive science is rated as a lower level science than predictive science, where I can make predictions. Now, do historians make predictions? Are they asked to make predictions with algorithms, with a beautiful mathematical model that makes predictions about history? I mean, our history. Historians would send you to hell if you ask them to develop these algorithms and perform these predictions. But there is another portion of the scientific community that does exactly that. Economists. Economy is driven by history. And these guys predict the future. and they are heard. They are heard. People hear them. Then the Queen arrives and asks to the London School of Economics, how comes that you didn't predict the crisis in 2008? Because something strange happened, because history is made of strange things. They can predict history if tomorrow is exactly like yesterday. Come on. And we are trying to do that in ecology too, because we have physics envy. So we want to transform natural history into physics, which is stupid. But then a very famous astrophysicist, UK astrophysicist, Stephen Hawking, he said, we are destroying the planet, we are on the verge of extinction and so on. So he framed a problem very correctly. Then he proposed a solution. Let's colonize other planets. We are doing it. We are doing missions to Mars, so they listen to him. Now, he knows very well, he used to know very well black holes or whatever, but he didn't know anything about ecology and evolution. Colonizing other planets is stupid. But we are investing billions to do that. Now there is a mission to Mars that is going to happen. And we discover exoplanets. I revised the projects for the Belgian ministry. The key word was habitability. And there were lots of projects on habitable planets. And they were drawing lots of money in exploring these stupid possibilities. So we are investing money in stupid enterprises, and we are not investing money to answer the question that Bob May, a physicist, asked. How many species are there on this planet? We don't know. But we are looking for extraterrestrial life. Come on. This is stupidity.
There was a very profound radio program in England which actually looked at the issue of ontology and epistemology around existence. And although it was delivered by a comedian and written by a comedian, it was very profound. And he criticized very much the ideology that you're describing. And he said so succinctly that he said, whenever anybody asks the question, are we alone in the universe? What happens is a slender loris in the jungle gives a very, very quiet cough. No, the point is asking the question, are we alone in the universe, neglects the fact that we are surrounded by millions of species who share the planet with us. So fortunately, those quite abstract questions are beginning to be asked in popular culture, which I think is very healthy, because it leads to a critique of, in exactly the way that you've just described, of some very, very perverse and dangerous assumptions.
Yes, it's a great point. Could I quickly go to the chat? And we were talking about taxonomy. There's a couple of interesting questions about taxonomy. Maz Wooten, who works for the Continuous Plankton Recorder Survey, which is an extensive survey of plankton in time and space that's run by the Marine Biological Association, asks, taxonomic skills are no doubt undervalued. Several members of our plankton analysis team could earn the same or more working in a supermarket. How do we attract and keep skilled people? So that's one, and I have another one after you've answered this, and then we can go from there.
Okay, so I think it is part of, there is a picture here. What we know is that on a broad front, the type of economy that we need needs to be far more sensitive to environmental concerns. We need to move to full sustainability. It requires a broad appreciation of the issues and specific knowledge. And so we do feel as though there need to be additions to the school curriculum and to qualifications in order to achieve that. When you begin to provide knowledge within the school system, it actually exerts upwards pressure People demand progression onto the next stage of education, and that itself produces roots. But we've also looked at the way in which the economic pressures to become sustainable will exert pressure on higher education and on career structures. And again, we feel this leads impetus to the provision of this kind of knowledge within schooling. It is needed. Remember, even in areas like classic engineering, which increasingly is being used to drive green industries, we have gross shortages. So 40,000 short in terms of engineering within the English economy alone. Many people feel that the engineering and the hard sciences are not attractive because they don't provide a route through into sustainable industry. Again, adding natural history to the range of sciences, so it can be taken alongside the classic sciences, opens up precisely the kind of progression routes that both individuals and society and the economy need. So it is part of transforming that. If we have these shortfalls in the economy, they will tend to be associated with higher wage return. So again, it is a question of being sensitive to the way in which the economy is being transformed. There may be very low wage return to these areas of knowledge currently, which is what the questioner has said, but really all the signs are that they will be in demand and therefore with a wage premium in the future.
Thank you. Mando,
Yes.
what's your view on that question?
On the question of taxonomy, it's a matter of economics. The knowledge of species should lead to the knowledge of biodiversity. And there are many programs on these things. The Census of Marine Life, the GBIF, Global Biodiversity Information Facility, LifeWatch. There is a huge number of projects that mobilized hundreds of millions of euros or dollars dedicated to biodiversity. Taxonomists are expected to work for free for these projects. And the people who are paid are information and technology people or bioinformatics or whatever, but the taxonomists are supposed to work for free. In the final paper on the Census of Marine Life, $100 million for the biodiversity of Canada, it is written, in Canada, there are no more taxonomists. There are only parataxonomists who can identify species from old books that they are unable to revise. We found several new species of polychaetes. Polychaetes, I'm not speaking about Chicliophora or strange things, polychaetes, worms. And there was nobody able to describe them properly. So we asked a Mexican taxonomist to do it. This Mexican taxonomist came to my laboratory and I asked her, how much did they give you to describe these species? And she said, oh, nothing. I did it, so I have another paper. So the taxonomists are expected to work for free for multimillionaire projects. If we continue to do that, we will disappear very soon. And now we disappeared already almost in the first country, in the first world countries, and they go to Mexico to find the taxonomists for describing their species. They hire Mexicans to pick the tomatoes and to describe the species. So it's a matter of investment in money in this knowledge. How much money do a taxonomist bring to the institute that hires him or her? If they are supposed to work for free, the money that will arrive will be zero. If it's zero, they will hire a computer technician or a molecular biologist who pushes buttons of PCR machines. And this is what is happening. So it's a matter of economy. And the economy measures the value of something with the willingness to pay for it by those who want it. And if the willingness to pay for taxonomy is zero, then the value of taxonomy becomes zero. There are billions dedicated to biodiversity, and taxonomy is going extinct because there is no money. There is money to go to other planets. There is no money to describe new species. I see also a question about artificial intelligence, but to recognize species. But taxonomy is not only identification of species that have been
exactly right.
identified already in the past. It's a completely different thing. It's not identification. Parataxonomists do identification. Taxonomy means also to explore biodiversity not only by describing corpses in little vials. We need to know what the life cycles of the species, what they do, what is their role in the environment, how do they make ecosystems function. This cannot be understood by looking at an image or by sequencing some DNA. So we need these sort of things. But the investments on this kind of knowledge is zero. So there is, again, a big mismatch, and the problem is economic.
So this is really important, and we've placed taxonomic principles at the heart of the Natural History GCSE, precisely because of the expansive understanding of it, which Nando has just described. I mean, it is not some kind of reductivist process of naming. It is about the identification and understanding of characteristics, of function, of process, of behavior. It is the identification of unique characteristics. It is understanding of life cycle. It is characterization of the context which give rise to these characteristics and which affect function, process, and unique characteristics. It is not some reductivist niche area of botanical or zoological thinking. It is fundamental, and we have made it something which is at the heart of the Natural History GCSE. I mean, I think if young people are exposed to the complexity and the utility of this thinking, and they take this qualification in the high numbers which we think they will do, then it exerts a lot of upwards pressure, Nando, on culture to incorporate these ideas and to see their importance. So we have quite high aims for this qualification, actually, and quite high expectations to transform the current state of affairs.
Yes, but the people who can teach these things are disappearing. So the next people who will study hydrozoans in the UK will not learn from a British person.
No, agreed.
Because there are none. So they will have to learn from books, but not from humans. Or they will have to go abroad, which is very bad.
We had a lot of criticism when Mary, Caroline and I first worked on the Natural History GCSE. When we outlined the qualification to people, just at the level of generality, all of them questioned the use of the term natural history to describe it, all of them. And we said, no, this is essential. Now we'll explain what the content of the qualification is. We'll explain what it is that we want young people to do and to learn and to experience and benefit from. And by the time that we described the detail, universally, the people said, right, you need to call it natural history. Great, but we had to undertake that discussion. We then have worked with a wide range of organizations, but preeminent amongst them is the Natural History Museum in England. And that has connections right down into all of the local communities in England through the network of museums, and it supports schools in learning activities. Fortunately, Nando, we can actually bridge that gap at the moment. We've got good professional development networks within England to support teachers, to enable them to get ready access to the ideas that they need to teach, which is great, I think.
well, I was speaking about science, not only about teaching, but this problem came out with Elton, who is one of the founders of modern ecology. In his book, Animal Ecology, in the 20s, he said that natural history had lost its reputation, and that natural history is seen as a group of guys with nets to go catching butterflies. And he proposed another name. It was ecology. And he said ecology is scientific natural history. And so this led to the replacement of the word natural history with ecology. But unfortunately, ecology, driven by physics envy, started to become predictive and mathematized. There are no formulas in the origin of species, okay? You cannot mathematize these things. Ecologists try to mathematize everything. And that's what Bob May did in his first ecological paper, Simple Mathematical Models with Very Complex Dynamics. After 10 years, he asked how many species are there on Earth, because it's useless to make all these formulas if you don't know the variables, and the variables are species. So lots of people understood these things, but it's very difficult now to regain a reputation for natural history, because it was in the scientific community that this reputation was questioned. And that's why we keep in our curricula, there is more, even in sciences, in natural sciences, there is more mathematics than zoology. And this is very bad, because in history, there is no mathematics. The historians don't study mathematics. We try to translate our science into mathematical terms. And this is very bad, because it's impossible. Or if it is possible, it's a very weak description of nature. The Lotka-Volterra equations, two species interacting. If there are three, it's chaos, and it's inherently unpredictable. And we keep selling predictions because we like to perform predictive sciences. Upgrading a descriptive science, natural history, to a predictive level. And this is done with mathematics. So people do more estimates than just looking. This is what Robert May wrote in his science paper on how many species are there on Earth. He proposed a research protocol, take bunches of taxonomists and send them all over the world to make the list of the species that they can find. Until this is done, I will not trust any estimate on biodiversity. You take not the last, but 2 issues ago in Science, there was a paper on biodiversity, and it was full of estimates. Nobody proposed to go out there and look for the species. There were estimates. So we are going in the wrong direction.
Nando and Tim, thank you very much. We're coming to the end of our 60 minutes now. I just think perhaps time for one more question from the chat, and then we can round up. So there's a question from Keith Hiscock here. There's a proper emphasis on taxonomy in the discussion, but naturalists observe traits. So growth rates, longevity, episodic disappearances, food preferences, larval behavior, etc., etc. Are there facilities, perhaps Wikipedia for popular species, to record those traits that are so important for understanding sensitivity and degree of threat?
Sure. Yes, it can be done with the public. We did it with the jellyfish. So the race of the jellyfish was questioned by some scientists because there were no papers on lots of jellyfish out there. but the people were seeing them. So we asked them, and we received the data because nobody was taking the data. So and we even discovered new species out of this exercise, like Pelagia venovici. Not new for the Mediterranean, new species to science. So of course it can be done with these tools, but then there has also to be a proper dignity to this kind of research in university curricula and in faculties. And now there are none. I asked how many taxonomists are in the faculty of Cambridge. Probably there are none. And the same is true for Oxford. And the same is becoming true in the Natural History Museum in London. There are more curators who take care of the exhibits than on the taxonomy of some groups, not to speak about marine stations. Okay, where there are many modelers.
So to follow that and to return to the question, there are certainly more opportunities through digital media, both to observe and collect data, but also to combine those data with national and international data sets, so that individuals can participate in distributed collective scientific enterprise. And I think that is a great opportunity in the new in the contemporary world. And it can be done in a disciplined way, and it gives often very young people a sense that they're doing things to professional standards. That's really very important. It inducts them into the professional world of science and makes them motivated and gives them a sense of status. But we do not want to assert that above direct observation and participation. That's really important. And so to give young people the means of undertaking genuine field study at whatever level, whether it's in the rural or the urban environment, we want that to play a key part in education through the provision of a natural history GCSE, really fundamental. And I think you've got a question on low income and rural versus urban, working class versus middle class, I think. Is that right?
Yes, yes, there's a question from Youssef. How would you support schools in low income areas which already have tight budgets focused on teaching the core curriculum?
Yeah, that's absolutely critical, and we are working on that. We have, as part of the proposal we're putting to the state and to government, actually really worked hard on whether there would be adequate provision across the nation for the provision. And so for the provision of the qualification and support to teachers, we've done a lot of work already on that with partner organisations, Natural History Museum, Field Studies Council, and so on. And with some universities. Bill Scott has been a great contributor to that. And we can be quite reassuring about that, I think. Whilst we have, because it's young people, you have to worry about the safeguarding, doing a river survey, very risky activity. So schools will need to have time and resource for that. They will need to make their own decisions about what they can make available and what activities can be undertaken safely and productively. But we think that's all doable. We think that with a magnifying glass or with time and patience, you can just as much observe things in the corner of the playground or the natural space around the school in an entirely safe way and incredibly richly, just as much as you can do it in Cuckmere Haven, in Sussex, or in Hereford. So I think we've covered that one. We think that all schools can give kids access to learning associated with this qualification.
Yes, bring them out of the school. They don't need a fancy laboratory to perform experiments. Bring them out. It costs nothing.
It's true. I think I'm sadly I'm going to have to draw a line under this discussion for the moment, but it's been a huge pleasure to have both of your wisdom and experience on this. It's made a fascinating discussion, and I hope it can be continued, perhaps through contributions to the magazine or communicating with the MBA membership, because as well as putting this out on YouTube, it would be great to have a follow-up conversation. It's a very important area. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to our guests, to Ferdinando Boero and to T.Oates. It's been fascinating and a privilege. Thank you. And thank you also everyone who joined us, all our MBA members. And we're just putting up a couple of slides here about the next talk that's coming up, which is the MBA Annual General Meeting on the 2nd of December. And we also have a membership slide, which reminds people that we are a membership organization and we're welcome to, open to members joining from all parts of society. And I'd like to say a final huge thank you to everybody, and we will sign off there and see you all at the next MBA talk. Thanks very much.
Ciao.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you, Guy. Thanks, Nando.
Ciao, thank you.